Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be demonstrating the 1x1 Italian cast on, which creates a beautiful edge for a 1x1 rib. To do this cast on, I have got my project yarn, which in my case is a nice chunky yarn. I have got the needle that I will want for my actual rib, which is a 5mm or US 8 knitting needle, and I have got a needle which is 1 US size or 0.5 millimeter smaller. So I have got a 4.5 US 7 here, and this is what I'm going to start my cast on with. The first thing we need to do is to establish how much yarn we actually need for this cast on. So I'm going to be casting on 12 stitches. So I'm going to begin by finding out how much yarn that's roughly going to take to knit. So to do this, I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to wrap it around my needle 6 times. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's how much it would take to knit about 6 stitches. And then I'm just going to double that. That will show me how much it's going to take to knit 12. So I want to now times that by 3 because you want a length of yarn 3 times the amount it would take to knit the number of stitches that you are casting on. So I'm going to fold this back on itself twice. So that's once and then twice. And that is the length of yarn that I'm going to need. And to set up, I'm going to take that length of yarn and find the middle. So I'm going to fold it in half, like so, and then using that midpoint, I can now set up. Once you've found the midpoint, you're going to place your forefinger and your thumb under the yarn and then tension the yarn below with these 2 fingers down here. And just make sure that it's the tail end that is traveling over your index finger. To create the first stitch, which is going to be a knit stitch, we're going to do something a bit different than the subsequent knit stitches that we're going to create for this cast on. We just need to basically twist the yarn around our needle for this one. So I'm just going to pop my needle on top of my yarn facing towards my hand and then twist it around until my yarn is wrapped once around my needle. I'm now ready to begin by creating a purl stitch. So to create a purl stitch, I like to think of it as coming outside of my finger and then over my thumb. So what I mean by that is I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to travel with it outside of the yarn that's going over my finger. And then I'm going to come back to the middle and then I'm going to go over my thumb and then back to how I began. So to create a knit stitch, I'm going to do the opposite and I'm going to come outside of my thumb and over my finger. So I am going to come outside of the yarn that's over my thumb, back to where I was, and then over the yarn that's over my finger, and once again back to where I was. So you can now see that I've created a purl stitch and a knit stitch. So I'm going to do a purl again. So that is going to be outside of my finger and over my thumb. So I'm going to start by going outside of the yarn that's over my finger, back to where I was, and then over the yarn that's over my thumb and back to where I was. Next up is another knit. So I'm going to come outside of my thumb and then over my finger and back to where I was. And then the way that I do this in my head, because now the motion is kind of ingrained, I just think of it, thumb is knit, finger is purl. So you can just keep repeating those 2 steps until you have the number of stitches that you want. If you are working flat, you will probably want an odd number of stitches, ending and beginning with a knit stitch. If you're working in the round, you'll probably want an even number of stitches, which is what I have got here. So I have begun with a knit stitch and ended with a purl stitch, and I've got 12 stitches. Now that I am reorientated with my working yarn to my right hand side, I'm ready to work my first setup row. I'm still going to use my smaller needle, and what I need to make sure here is that my tail is pulled kind of to my front, because I need that to lock in the last stitch I created, which is now going to obviously be the first stitch that I work, which in my case is a knit stitch. So I need to pull this tail towards me at the front just to lock that stitch in whilst I work it. So all the knit stitches on this first setup row are worked through the back loop, because the way that we've created them in that cast on, they're actually twisted on the needles. So I'm going to put my needle through the back loop of that first stitch and knit it. And then all the purl stitches on this row, we bring the yarn to the front of our work as if to purl, but then we actually just slip them purlwise and then take the yarn to the back. So once again, I'm going to knit this stitch through the back loop. Then I'm going to bring my yarn to the front and slip one purlwise, take my yarn back to the back and knit one through the back loop. And I'm just doing that all the way to the end of the row. This setup row and the one that follows are both done exactly the same for working flat or working in the round. They are both performed in the flat with the smaller needle. So there we go. I've slipped that last one purlwise. And once again, I'm just going to reorientate so that the working yarn is over to my right hand side. And now we are ready to work the second setup row. So sticking with my smaller needle, I can now knit these stitches normally. I'm also going to purl my stitches normally on this row. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, not through the back loop. And then I'm going to purl, knit, and I'm just going to work like that until the end of the row. And it does take a few rows from this point till you can really see how beautiful this edge is. I am now going to join in the round. I'm going to do that by setting up for magic loop. Obviously, if you have cast on and you're doing a project where you work flat, you can just carry on from this point, switching to your ribbing needle. You can, if you're working in the round, you can obviously use a circular needle if you wish to, or DPNs, or like me, set up for magic loop. I have orientated myself ready for magic loop, and I've got the working yarn attached to the back needle. I'm ready to work this front needle, beginning with a knit stitch, but instead of pulling out my back needle and using it to work these front stitches, I'm going to pull out my back needle, but then use my larger needle, which is my ribbing needle, to work my front stitches. So it doesn't really change anything particularly, just remember to do that switch. So I'm taking my working yarn from the back and I'm going to work across that first needle, starting with a knit stitch. Just making sure I'm keeping a nice tension on that yarn and working across those stitches. I have now once again reorientated so my working yarn is to my right hand side. I've got these stitches on my front needle, they're still on my smaller needle. My larger needle has now worked these stitches that are now on my back needle. So I'm going to pull that needle through and knit across my smaller needle with it. Well, not knit, work. Knit and purl across my smaller needle with it. And now my smaller needle is free and it can just be popped over to one side. And I am good to just carry on working in the round, which I am going to do for a number of rounds so that you can see how this edge actually looks once you've got an established chunk of rib. And also so I can show you how I like to neaten up this tiny little gap that you get in the cast on edge right where we joined in the round. So I've now worked enough rows that I think you can really see how lovely that edge is and the way that those stitches just sort of roll over, completely uninterrupted over the edge of that cast on. And also I think you can also probably see now why we use that smaller needle for the first couple of setup rows. It's just so it doesn't sort of flare out. I mean, once this is in use, it's still really nice and stretchy, but these stitches just aren't too flared. If you use the same needle size that you're actually going to use for your rib, I find those just don't look as good. So I've gone ahead and popped my tail onto a tapestry needle so that I can show you what I like to do just to neaten up this join in the cast on edge where we have a kind of little discrepancy here, or a little gap almost. So I like to bring the yarn on my tapestry needle through the knit stitch that's to the left of this kind of gap. And I like to come from inside my work, or the back, or however you want to think of it, but I kind of think of it as inside my knitting. And I'm coming towards myself through the base of that knit stitch. And I'm just going to pull that through. And then I turn my work inside out, which is normally not such a challenge. This is a very, very small tube. And then I just weave my yarn end in. So I'm coming up through here. And I'm just going to weave that end in as I would normally weave an end in. It's not going to be the easiest thing to see because, like I say, I've got a very narrow little tube here, which is unusual. And I'd weave that end in, make sure it's really nice and secure. I'm just going to get that out the way now, that yarn. And that just really finishes off that edge and just makes it much harder to identify. So yes, that is the end of our Italian cast on. I hope you found this video really helpful, and happy knitting.